Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're looking back on a densely packed year of great games and trying to pick out the top 5 from the lot. That means we're looking primarily at strategy, sim, management, RPG, and city building games, and of course, it's based entirely on my opinion. If you have any thoughts of your own and you'd like to share them, I'd love to hear them. And no, that's not me being sarcastic. Drop your own picks in the comments down below and let me know what you think of mine. I am always curious. If you're looking for more great games from the year that didn't quite make the cut into this video, I can highly recommend checking out my Games You Missed in 2021 video that I dropped just a little while ago. I'll link it in the description, the pinned comment, and under the eye at the top right corner of the screen. It features 10 excellent games that didn't get enough attention, but I think are well worth your time. Today though, like I said, we're looking at my personal top 5 games of 2021, so without further ado, let's begin. In at number 5 is Lemniscate. A bit of a surprise, I'm sure, and it was for me too. When the idea was first brought to my attention, I was pretty sure it'd just be another game to miss the mark in blending strategy and first-person shooter mechanics. The last time I remember really enjoying the blend was Battlezone back in 1998, and I know it's been attempted with varying degrees of success since then, but Lemniscate was the first time I was immediately engaged, and I had an absolute blast playing it. Played either 1v1 or 2v2 in a few different formats and modes, a game always consists of 2 teams, 2 halves, multiple turns within each half, and a set of objectives, like capture the thing, or destroy the thing, or claim the space, you know, the usual formats. Now that all sounds pretty par for the course so far, but where things get really compelling is how the turn-based system works. Each half represents 25 seconds of time, and that's it. But you play those same 25 seconds multiple times each. What that means is that in a regular 1v1 game, the first player chooses their first operative, each with their own special abilities, pros and cons, and they go about executing the first 25 seconds on a clean slate. The second player then plays over top of those same 25 seconds, able to interact with, engage with, or avoid that first player's first operative. Then it goes back to the first player, who once again overwrites the same 25 seconds, able to assist their own first operative, engage with the second player's first operative, or do something else entirely. You go back and forth, and while objectives might change hands each turn, the final timeline at the end of the half is all that matters as far as scoring points is concerned. So, not only are your FPS skills put to the test in traditional FPS ways, but your ability to think strategically, to pick the right operative for the right phase of the game, and to make the right moves with said operative are all essential. You'll adapt to overcome your opponent's decisions, and you look for unexpected angles and approaches, holding an ace up your sleeve for the final round at times to catch your opponent completely off guard. Do you start with the fastest operative, quickly nabbing as many objectives as possible? Do you throw random grenades to block off access points for future turns? Do you fire into empty spaces, hoping that your opponent forgets about a rogue missile that ends up killing them in a future turn? I've described Lemniscate as 4D chess with rocket launchers and machine guns in the past, and that remains, to me, the best way to present it. You're thinking 3 moves ahead, making sure you save the right operative for the right time, anticipating your opponent's plans, hoping they've not got a trick up their sleeve that counters the one up yours. Lemniscate is a lot of fun. It does have 2 major shortcomings that prevent it from climbing higher up this list though. One is the character design. It feels a little on the generic side, from a visual perspective primarily. The special abilities and designations are also a little plain. You have your sniper that can slow down time, your robot guy, your guns akimbo speedster. Nothing really stands out as particularly unique to this world of time travelers, except for maybe the guy that can teleport using his special ability. And yes, visually even more generic, kind of your typical sci-fi character tropes thrown together. The second shortcoming is a little meta, and that's the small player base. It really is unfortunate, but I just don't think enough people realize the greatness of playing Lemniscate, and that means matchmaking can be a little slow, which is obviously problematic. Still, I hope to see Lemniscate get some more love and attention. It's a great idea and hits some really great notes, and is well worth checking out with a few friends. Again, it's played in 1v1 or 2v2, so if you've got a couple of friends and you're curious to check this game out, I'd suggest you all dive in on it, check it out, and have a wonderful time. I know I did. Sitting at number 4, Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous was an instant hit in my books. I enjoyed Pathfinder Kingmaker by the same studio and figured I'd enjoy Wrath of the Righteous as a result, but I didn't realize just how much more engaging everything was going to be, from the writing to impactful decision-making to the character creation process and more besides. Wrath of the Righteous is built off the tabletop RPG system Pathfinder's First Edition, and if you're a fan of Pathfinder on tabletop, you'll find Wrath of the Righteous to be an excellent adaptation from tabletop to digital. If you aren't a big fan of Pathfinder or tabletop RPGs in general, fear not. Wrath of the Righteous stands on its own merits just as well, providing an excellent CRPG experience with a great degree of customization, excellent visual flair, a great story to explore, and some solid twists on the genre, some of which will be familiar to players of Kingmaker. Now, I want to be very clear that, naturally, the game does have its limitations as far as CRPGs are concerned when compared to their tabletop counterparts. There are moments that feel, yes, railroaded, and there are times when it feels like your choices are second to the story that needs to be told. This is part and parcel of the CRPG experience, and I only bring it up because I often see people talk about these games as similar to the tabletop experience, and that's true as far as the number crunching is concerned, but the RP part is obviously limited by the fact that this is a video game and there are only a finite number of possibilities at any given turn. I just want to be clear on that front because I don't want to mislead anybody into thinking it's a tabletop experience where everything is truly in your hands. It's just a top-notch adaptation of the rule set into a CRPG. Now, there are some changes made to the rule set here and there to better fit the mold of playing a video game, but none of those detract from the experience. The minutiae in character creation, the spread of stats and skills and feats and how they're applied for social and action sequences alike is great. It can be a little overwhelming for folks who are unfamiliar with Pathfinder, but as somebody who himself last played Pathfinder about a decade ago, having since moved on to other systems, I found the tooltips and tutorialized opening to be a great way to ease into the game, though in harder difficulties, mistakes can be very difficult to recover from. To me, that's always part of the fun. The use of non-combat skills, the pacing between action and narrative beats, and the option to play combat in either real-time or turn-based in particular all comes together nicely and presents an experience that doesn't get bogged down by tedium and slow turn cycles. The whole aspect of leading Crusader armies is an added layer, much like Kingmaker had its kingdom management, and I feel like the Crusade aspect is a bit of a mixed bag, so far removed mechanically from my favorite parts of Wrath of the Righteous, so while not bad, per se, I felt like it was taking me away from my favorite aspects at times. Nonetheless, Wrath of the Righteous tells a fun story using a fun system, doing a tremendous job of bringing such an immense rule set into CRPG format in a compelling, clear, and enjoyable way. Definitely one of my top games of the year. In at number 3 is Wildermyth, an absolutely magical experience that I didn't dive into until well after its release, and boy do I wish I'd gotten into it sooner. This and Wrath of the Righteous were jostling for position on this list quite a bit, but at the end of the day, the way in which Wildermyth's generative storytelling worked just blew me away, and the setting, the art, the writing, and the apparent simplicity of it all came together to create a very unique experience. After completing the introductory story-driven campaign, you'll have access to a few more story-driven campaigns alongside procedurally generated ones that don't have an overarching plot as much as they are a series of adventures your characters go on. Whether story-driven or procedurally generated, each campaign begins with a band of a handful of adventurers that can either be randomly generated themselves, or customized to a slight degree, or brought in from a previous adventure with most of their equipment and skills intact. Each character has a few key traits that determine how they interact with the world and the people around them, and how they might deal with circumstances, sometimes entirely of their own volition, sometimes based on choices you make. When using new characters, each will also have their class predetermined, so you know who's going to end up as your melee combatant, your ranged combatant, and your spellcaster, in case you want to be particular about names and traits, which you should be, since this is a game about building legacies. Each character that goes on an adventure will develop traits based on events and decisions they make, and will accumulate gear, history, and more skills. These characters live outside their individual adventures, less attached to any one specific continuity, and more as legendary or mythical adventurers of yore who have participated in many disparate tales of daring do. Overall, this creates an absolutely fantastic roster of characters of your own making, each of who have gone through their own trials and tribulations, sometimes together. These trials and tribulations themselves are laid out across a procedurally generated map that you can travel through, going from sector to sector, recruiting new adventurers or familiars, participating in turn-based tactical battles against one of 5 different categories of enemies, and building upgrades that provide you with resources to later on craft with. Enemies upgrade over time with each encounter, and occasionally they'll upgrade after a certain number of days have passed, or they'll send out an incursion you have to fend off. You'll have greater objectives to pursue beyond random encounters, but beyond combat itself are the story and character moments that can unlock a variety of elements. Sometimes a character will come across an artifact or be attacked or engaged in some way, and your choices will determine if they leave unscathed or, with a missing limb, or perhaps a strange mutation that gives them special abilities or buffs. And these choices and their impacts will live on with that character should you choose to use them in a future adventure. A missing hand remains missing when you start a new story using the same character, and the same goes for gear you've acquired and customized, familiars you've befriended, or offspring you've produced, as long as they haven't died or otherwise been lost. Wildermyth is full of surprises, a plethora of well-written events to read through that will sometimes wax poetic and at other times tell a groan-worthy joke, but it'll always be interesting and engaging. As a fan of tabletop RPGs and role-playing in general, this really struck a chord with me. I think fondly back to some of my characters from around the table and the adventures they'd been on, and Wildermyth looks to do the same as you build legacies for your adventurers, less focused around the adventure or the story itself, and more focused on what said character did during them. There's a multiplayer mode, there are map seeds, there are punishing, harder difficulties, and there are fun mechanics in combat that rely on positioning, taking possession of inanimate objects using your spellcasters, and taking advantage of movement points, action points, and special skills that develop over time through leveling up. There are opportunities to acquire better equipment through loot and to craft others which you can name and customize to further build your legacy, and there are layers of complexity to the mechanics that might not seem immediately evident when looking at the game. Wildermyth has been tremendously fun, and it's a game that you can easily return to over and over again, playing the 3 or 5 chapter randomly generated campaigns, short as they are, watching your characters develop, age, or retire, or perhaps die. It really feels like you're peering into sort of collective folklore. I don't know. Wildermyth is a really special game, and you really have to play it to understand what makes it so special. It struck a chord with me like almost no other game ever has, and it's nestled itself into one of the top spots of 2021 as a result. At number 2, Humankind might be my most contentious pick of the bunch, but I stand by this game as deserving of this spot in my top 5, and it would have been higher too, but for a few flaws. Funnily enough, some of my favorite aspects of the game are what cause most people to dislike it, so let's get into it. And hey, just a reminder, I do welcome opposing opinions in my comments, just let's keep them civil. On the topic of civilization is the most common point of comparison for Humankind. It is, after all, a historical turn-based 4X game where you lead your people to victory against others on a tile-based map where you exploit the tiles to generate resources such as food, industry, science, and money. You build buildings on said tiles, and sometimes within your cities, and you manage how your populations are assigned, expanding your territory over time as you travel down a tech tree, going further and further through the historical eras until eventually your tanks are pummeling enemy spearmen and you steamroll your way to victory. That's where the similarities kind of end though, as Humankind really stands on its own 2 legs with its own premise, its own ideas, and its own successes and shortcomings alike. See, Humankind focuses around the idea of culture and cultural evolution separate from the idea of national identity. While most games of this sort have you playing as a country or a political entity like an empire or kingdom, say Macedonia, France, Rome, Germany, etc., Humankind has you playing as the cultures of those nations separate from the nations themselves. You play as the French, not as France. You play as the Farsi, not the Achaemenid Empire, so on and so forth. Not only do I find this an interesting premise, I quite like the spread of cultures that we see in the game, from the Olmecs to the Goths to the Haudenosaunee to the Haruppans and Poles and Mycenaeans, so on and so forth. We see cultures that don't often get time in the spotlight in historical titles. 10 unique cultures for each of 6 eras, each with their own unique legacy trait that follows you through your entire game, and each with their own unique unit and district building too. As you transition through the eras, you can choose to either continue as your existing culture, or you can transition to any one of the 10 available in the next era, as long as somebody else hasn't already picked it. This is another major point of contention for many, while I quite like the idea. Culture is mutable, changing over time, and our modern cultures are the result of the mixing and matching of historical cultures over the past millennia. Humankind tries to model that, and while some thought it was weird to go from, Mongol to Spanish, to me, that was the point. We were given the opportunity to build new cultural identities by making new mixes and matches throughout history. These differentiators made for a game that stood apart from others tonally and stylistically, but there were also major gameplay implications. For example, in a game like Civilization, you pick a civ to play as forever, and you might see your unique units and buildings lose value in later eras, or maybe you won't have access to them until said later eras. In a game like Civilization, you know who you're up against and you know what they might be building towards because you know what their unique abilities, units, and buildings are, and so you'll counter them before they even get to them if you can. In Humankind, though, since you're picking a new culture every era, it means you have new toys to play with as you go along, as well as new toys to deal with on the AI side. So rather than a one-and-done sort of a deal, your entire game is constantly evolving as your people are through the eras. Beyond that, the battles in Humankind are completely unique, though they'll be familiar to players of Endless Legends. Turn-based battles taking place within the turns of the greater campaign, integrating unit traits and terrain tiles in interesting ways, making your city building and planning more impactful, as the positioning of certain buildings and their use in combat can make a world of difference. Holding back a tide of enemy soldiers with the help of a mountain pass in the ancient era is a great feeling, as is using bombing runs to crush an amphibious assault while rushing from one end of your nation to the other with airports and train stations in the later eras. Humankind has a lot of fresh ideas. It's got an active and growing modding scene introducing new units, cultures, and maps, and it's got some great legs for future support as well. But that's not to say it's without any flaws. After all, it's sitting in second place. There are issues, big and small, that get in the way of the experience in various ways. Referring to your counterparts by their culture name is strange, as that keeps changing every so often, and while that sounds insignificant, it creates a disconnect with the world, and that dissonance can certainly make an impact in telling a historical tale. Talking about a centuries-long war between the Greeks and the Achaemenids is one thing, it has a certain gravitas, but a 20-year war between the Greeks and the Achaemenids, followed by a 10-year war between the Goths and the Achaemenids, followed by a 4-year war between the Goths and the Huns, is jarring when you realize that the Greeks and Goths are the same player, and the Achaemenids and the Huns are the same player. It breaks the story up, and as I said, it creates a dissonance that gets in the way, especially if you're big on role-playing when you play. The biggest problem, though, is one that is typical to this genre. Snowballing is not a unique problem to Humankind, and while I can certainly recommend the game despite it, the fact remains that it can make the latter half of any game of Humankind feel rather repetitive when you're playing against the AI. A little different in multiplayer against other humans, but against the AI, you've got that snowballing. It's better on higher difficulties, but it really is just a matter of shifting the tipping point to later in the game. The endgame often feels a little lackluster, either in the implementation of some of the endgame victory conditions or in how easily you'll crush any and all opposition without needing to try too hard. Again, it's the steamrolling, right? It's a familiar problem for the genre, and it's too bad Humankind hasn't been able to solve it, even with some updates to how the endgame and other systems work. Beyond that, the tech tree is rather humdrum, very predictable, and with it all outlined ahead of time, it becomes yet another, again, just predictable element. With that said, the fame-focused gameplay means that military supremacy isn't the only way to win. You just have to accomplish the most impressive feats and deeds, and even if you get wiped out, you might come out in first place. The likelihood of that happening is just extremely low. Humankind has been an absolute joy to play, warts and all, and that's why it sits comfortably at number 2. I think fans of 4X games should definitely check it out. I think it brings some much-needed competition to the space, and I think the devs have a gem in their hands that just needs a bit more polishing in some spots. Before we get to the number 1 spot, remember folks, I have a whole video full of other great games from the year that I think are well worth checking out. They didn't make it onto the top 5 list, sure, but there are some absolute gems, and I just think they didn't get enough attention from myself on the channel and from other outlets too. Again, I have the video linked in the description and pinned comment down below, as well as under the eye at the top right corner of the screen, and I highly suggest checking it out for a look at 10 great gems from 2021. If you like some of the footage you're seeing on screen right now, that video is about some of these games, so, hop on over, give it a look. But with that said, it's time to touch on the game of the year. If you've got a guess, go ahead and drop it down in the comments. It might be a little predictable, but it's honestly an undeniable winner for 2021. Age of Empires 4 is hands down my game of the year for 2021. There isn't much to say, really. Age of Empires is a bread and butter franchise when it comes to the RTS genre, and when it was first announced, I think many of us, myself included, were quite nervous. How do you improve on the formula? How do you change that which is near perfection without potentially taking it farther away from said perfection? Was this a stone better left unturned, or would Relic somehow manage to make a worthy successor? Age of Empires 1 and 2 were formative games for me, and while I wasn't the biggest fan of Age of Empires 3, I held on to hope that Age of Empires 4 would be a return to form, changing just enough to reinvigorate the experience without peeling too far away from whence it came. And somehow, Relic managed to hit the nail on the head, at least in my books. The different factions available at launch are varied enough that they encourage different playstyles to varying degrees, from the Delhi Sultanate's slow but free tech rate until you get scholars, to the Mongols' ability to move buildings across the map, to the Chinese tax officers, to, well, you get the picture. The differentiators aren't just a matter of a few units here and there or a building or two, and while those are still factors, there are much bigger variances between the factions that show up both in multiplayer as well as single-player modes. Each faction is interesting to look at through the ages, and on that note, the visual style of the game remains colorful, vibrant, and engaging without getting lost in grit and grim. Or grime. Grime. Gritty, you know what I mean. Look, I love a good, gritty, gray, dark historical strategy game, don't get me wrong, but not every single one needs to look like that, and Age of Empires 4's art style embraces a sense of vibrant history, from its buildings, to its units, to the terrain upon which they march, and the videos that act as transitional storytelling elements between story missions. Now, I'll be honest, this was jarring at first, but between story missions, you're presented with a documentary-style video acting as a segue. These are very nicely produced videos. They feel like sort of a reference to BBC documentaries you might see. They're well narrated, well shot, and really quite engaging, but they felt very out of place at first. The first time one started, I was almost transported to those good old Red Alert FMV cutscenes. I mean, again, these are of an infinitely higher production quality, but it was just a sudden and unexpected visual shift. Once I realized their intent, however, they became one of my favorite aspects of the single-player campaign, and it made me think of how video games were what really made me fall in love with learning about history in the first place, and Age of Empires has always been a key contributor to that love. So it felt like a nice, not-so-subtle nod to that aspect of my, and I'm sure many others, interest in history as well. Now, they could certainly have pushed this element a bit harder and farther, but in the context of what they were meant to do, I think the documentary-style sequences served their purpose very well. The single-player campaigns and faction crash courses are varied and challenging as you go on, with interesting set pieces and scripted elements to boot. Beyond that, you can also play a few different types of games against the AI in single-player or in co-op if you wish, varying from the simple skirmish to more complex game modes, some of which have something of a narrative element to them. But beyond and perhaps above all that is the multiplayer action. There are changes to the formula, yes, but Age of Empires 4 retains the feeling of a classic RTS and modernizes it like no other has been able to do. From base building to recruiting to teching up, from building layouts to pop management to resource acquisition, from turtling to harassing to scouting, it's all there with enough variance between the factions to again keep things interesting and fresh. Age of Empires 4 managed something that felt almost impossible until it actually released. It revived a classic, keeping its roots intact while changing it just enough to bring it to the 21st century. It's got room for DLC, adding new factions with unique units, buildings, and mechanics alongside new single-player campaigns, and it's already seeing a lot of post-launch support from the developers and community alike. Age of Empires 4 has been one of my most anticipated games ever since it was first announced so many years ago. Now that it's finally out, I'm glad I can say it delivered. There you have it, my personal top 5 picks of 2021. These videos are always challenging to make. It's hard to encapsulate what makes one game stand out over another, especially across multiple genres. But after much deliberation, I feel like these 5 were the top contenders in a densely packed year full of gems. Yes, again, I've got a bunch of other games that I do highlight. If you want to check it out, again, I feel like a broken record. The link is in the description and pinned comment down below under the eye at the top right corner of the screen, but these are the top 5, hands down. If you have thoughts of your own, if you agree or disagree, or just have a few picks of your own you'd like to share, do so in the comments down below. I am, again, always curious to see how others feel, and it's a great way to revisit some of the releases from the past year. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to kick next year off with talk of some of my most anticipated games of 2022. For that and more strategy, RPG, sim, city building, and management gaming related content, don't hesitate to subscribe to this channel. As always, a massive thanks goes out to all of the channel members and patrons who've been supporting the channel on a monthly basis. Y'all keep us alive and running smoothly. And of course, a big ol' thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.